Hello guys, I'm Black Iris and welcome to my spooky review. More Eldritch horror is mandatory. Let's start with a vibe check of my first movie recommendation, Offseason. This story evokes the blurred horizons of a nightmare. The confined land make this place ideal for horror. A separate entity from the world, a liminal place both real and unknown, shrouded in fog and shadows. The main character embodied a struggle against their own roots, an everyday effort more relevant than we like to admit. Inevitability is the key that defines inner demons. The past is always conditioning our behavior, and sometimes the curse is real. The constant threat of a fate decided by others, something that cannot be escaped entirely, this feeling pervades the movie. A sense of fatalistic helplessness is in Lovecraft stories a recurring feature haunting the characters. Like in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, The Shadow over Innsmouth and Pickman's Model, this movie succeeds in making the anguish palpable. It plays on the unconscious fear that we cannot evade our personal history, not even avoid the consequences brought upon us by others. Doesn't matter how far we go, how safe we feel, sometimes something came back. In a dehumanizing society without self-determination and freedom, rebellion is seen as an unforgivable threat. A theme reminiscent of Finlay's novel Invasion of the Body Snatchers, a tale that spawned the best science fiction movies of the last century. If you feel at odds with the whole world, especially your family, this masterpiece is for you. After all, for many people, the worst place they could think of going is not a remote planet or a haunted castle. Are you ready to come home? Speaking of hell is other people, could be the tagline for this next movie, The Mist. It possessed the ideal cocktail of suspense and gore created by Stephen King to scare you to death and maybe warn you. The worst danger we should be aware of is not only the things from elsewhere, but our neighbors. These irritating, indifferent, or straight-out aggressive people are merely a nuisance in everyday life. But what about they became our lifeline? What about if our life depends on how well we go along? Something that made the TV series Walking Dead so interesting to me was the use of this trope in their stories. How the characters interact with each other in order to survive. The mutual hostility of the people involved, despite themselves in facing the crisis together, is a breath of raw realism. As stated by the director, the story is not so much about the monsters on the outside, but rather the monsters on the inside. That is, the people you are stuck with, who collapse under external pressures in extreme situations. Can we really trust our families and friends? Can we trust ourselves with others when faced with the threat of being ostracized or hurt? Will we do the right thing if put in the position of being punished otherwise? Will we be compassionate given absolute authority? To set out with our protagonist is to set out on one of the most disturbing and desperate adventures that can challenge our perspective, such as in the most interesting cultish Lovecraft stories like The Horror in the Museum. The men are those to really fear. The director also conceived a new ending for the movie, so don't think you already knew the story if you read the novel. The experience is very strong and dramatic, and the author praised the new ending, describing it as very problematic. It's real traumatic shock. Only for connoisseurs who can appreciate a real existential crisis well done, in my opinion. Those confronted with impossible choices will know how to find themselves in the game of death depicted here, where the only sure thing is that you will lose every ounce of humanity no matter what you do. Following a similar sense of despair, I must suggest The Whisperer in Darkness. If you love Lovecraft, this movie is a must-see. It is based on the short story that goes by the same name, but the ending is different and so are some other details that will keep you intrigued. Watching it, you will experience the distinctive feeling of a black and white horror. This is intentional. a blend of vintage and modern filming techniques intended to reproduce the look of the Golden Age cult movies. At first quiet, soon evolves into a cinematic version of a sleep paralysis. I was transfixed by the brutality it is able to convey by carefully using the environment, the suggestions evoked by the characters and their reactions, an old method that fits well with the narrative style of cosmic horror. It frightens more by what it conceals, rather what is exposed to sight. Like a whisper in the darkness bring infinite anguish, though without an apparent threat, for the possibilities of danger it carries, even more menacing by being hidden and unknown. This movie managed to cross the line between anxiety and reasonable fear, building around our perception, confirming us that it's all true. We are right to be afraid of the dark. We don't even imagine what might move concealed from our eyes. We do well in turn away from woodlands and run if we hear a strange voice calling us. Our gut instinct knows more than we think. The ancestral physiological reaction it makes us experience is visceral. It is not easy to render this kind of subtle panic via visual means. It certainly succeeds in surprising me and giving me the creeps. Another movie that follows the golden rule of show, don't tell is The Antenna. The rarefied and ominous atmosphere expands, feeding off the characters and the desolation of the settings, giving us a growing sense of corruption we cannot evade. This vibe of decadence pervades the story like a corrosive acid. Is that triggering sensation of being trapped, conquered by a force as inescapable as it is real in our cities and dominates our homes. The constant media presence, beacons scattered everywhere, ruthless government aiming at citizen control are fuel for conspiracy theories, also grounded in inconvenient truths that characterize industrialization and our technologically advanced civilizations, obsessed with electronic signals, to the point of losing all sense of reality and sense of self. Ironic to tell this on this platform, which is another sign to me of how relevant the movie is, and the silent presence of the device filled with strange projections, it is deeply ingrained into our everyday lives. This idea of a pervasive, ethereal, destructive force which strips away humanity's capacity of reason and corrupts everything with their mind-controlling powers reminds me greatly of Cthulhu and his devious dream presence onto the world. The movie also reminds me of both Orwell's 1984 and the atmosphere of the video game Little Nightmares. Dive into this dark parallel universe of dystopian hallucinations. It may raise interesting questions about our realities. Who is the real user? The same question brings us to Body Bags. Collection of standalone episodes, yet in their shortness disorienting and horrifying. My favorite is undoubtedly the one about hair. Maybe it's a stretch, but I couldn't help but think at Medusa's Coil Lovecraft story. Needless to say, it is the most grotesque thing since the thing I ever gaze upon. Following the classic theme of silent invasion, so dear to Lovecraft and so dear to Carpenter, the story develops with a very original direction, and like all of his work, it is focused on the mundane, unfiltered human nature of the character. There is plenty of weaknesses that ruthless visitors could exploit in our hedonistic society, something that also the TV series X-Files often pointed out. For the aliens who would not need to come down in full force, shooting all over the place, bombing to conquer, this is certainly more how humans do stuff. The short movie explored the concept that the individual is far defenseless than the collective, and the best action is the one that takes the objective by surprise. We wouldn't see it coming until it's too late. Carpenter once again shows our flaws, which are much easier to retort against us than the wasteful use of weapons. Humankind should look more to itself than direct its fear elsewhere. Why humans surrender their body autonomy so quickly to dubious institutions in the hope of gaining benefits without thinking carefully about the consequences, and how this transaction would actually work to their advantage if they really do so. The last one is a classic, even if it's a remake. Village of the Damned. Although he has been criticized and generally considered a flop, I love it. The contrast between the apparent innocence of the children and their true nature is flawlessly executed. This concept reminds me of Lovecraft's character Wilbur Wheatley from the short story The Dunwich Horror. It gave me chills more than many monsters movies because here, evil takes over the intimacy of people on a distressing level. It merged into the fabric of the family, one of the basic structure of society. It is something that is not so easy to deal with, to understand, and to fight. The violence blends so well into city life, hiding between relationships in plain sight, that it's impossible to separate it from the emotional attachment the humans tend to have for their relatives. Shunning, indifference, fear fill this movie with dread. The victims suffer in silence and sometimes in silence disappear. To me, could be an efficient metaphor for how hard it is to recognize and counter abuse behind the walls of the home. How often things are not as they seem. We tend to ignore the threats right under our noses until it's too late. All because feelings such as compassion and desire for cohesion lead generally to a compulsion to find common ground with calculating minds that have no interest in coming to terms with us, what they think to be inferior beings in this case. Being human means to be weak against a ruthless enemy, a force that overcomes our intelligence and strength. How can be defeated? Perhaps there are human qualities that could be our salvation. I recommend giving it a chance and finding out for yourselves. Don't be put off by the children's peculiar, almost carnivalesque makeup, which is very reminiscent of vintage horror illustration and the 60s sci-fi. Carpenter's skillful narration and the actor's incredible job will draw you into the depths of terror. Thank you for watching. If you wish, subscribe and give me a thumbs up to support this content and receive more. Bye, Eldritch creatures. Stay tuned for other messages from the beyond.